we were finishing up last time is we were going through the different processes, the different critical processes that will lead us to allow the respiratory system to do its job. So the first thing that we were talking about was ventilating the lungs. And we said that in order to ventilate the lungs, there are two critical pressures that are involved, and we see them up on the screen right there, right? So one is atmospheric pressure. That's the pressure out here where we're getting our air. And then the other one is the intra-alveolar pressure. And we said the alveoli are all those little bag-like or grape-like sacs that make up the lungs. And so we're talking about the pressure inside of those little bubbles. And so we said that this has to do with changing the volume of our lung cavities and of the lungs themselves. And the way that we do that is we end up contracting different what are called inspiratory muscles. So what we have is the main one right here, which is the diaphragm. We have other ones that help out, which are going to be like external intercostals. There's even some muscles up here at the neck, like the scalenes and the sternocleidomastoid and things like that, that will be recruited if you're really taking big breaths in. But in any case, when these various muscles contract, it's going to increase the volume of the pleural cavities and of the thoracic cavity, if you will. And as we increase the volume, then the pressure is going to go down. And so if that pressure goes down below atmospheric, like we see here, then there's going to be enough of a gradient where the air is going to move from high concentration or high pressure to low concentration or low pressure. In this case, it's going to go into the lungs, and we're going to have inspiration or inhalation. Okay? So remember, there is this inverse relationship, this opposite relationship between volume and pressure. So when the volume goes up, the pressure goes down, and vice versa. So we're using this example if we had to meet for our class in my office, we'd have the same number of people, but we'd have a very small volume. So there'd be a big pressure in order to get a seat and a place to write and be able to see the screen and things like that, right? So given the fact we're in a big room here, that means there's a lot less pressure, a lot lower pressure for those types of things. Okay, so that was inhalation, and exhalation or expiration was in essence going to be where these various inspiratory muscles relax. So then the side walls of the respiratory cavity or the thoracic cavity are going to come in. The thorax is going to rise up again, and that's going to create a smaller volume, and that's going to increase the pressure inside of the pleural cavities. That's going to cause the lungs to shrink, and then that will, as the volume goes down, that pressure is going to go up. And once it is above atmospheric, then we're going to see air move out. It's going to move from high to low, but it's going to be moving out instead. Okay? So these are the mechanics of ventilation, the first critical step in our respiratory system function. Okay? So, are you guys straight on that? Okay. So if we had questions on the exam that was, asking you how we inspire the lungs or how we inflate the lungs, you could talk about muscles involved, pressures involved, stuff like that. Yeah? Okay. All right. So, it's a bit like we were talking about like sliding filament theory and things like that, If you don't understand that those muscles and those pressures are how we ventilate the lungs, then you don't understand a big chunk of how the respiratory system works. Okay, so in terms of those volumes and things like that, like we were looking at when we were looking at cardiovascular system, there are various ways that a doctor might assess how well your organs are doing what they're supposed to do. And so one of the ways that they do that is they will use what's called a spirometer. And a spirometer, there are what are called wet spirometers and dry spirometers and things like that. And the wet spirometers, we have some downstairs in the lab. It basically is a container that has water in it, and it's got this inverted bell that goes down to the water. And it's got a tube coming out of it, and what you do is you breathe into the tube, it puts air underneath that bell, and it causes the bell to rise up. And so the amount that the bell rises up is the same volume of air that you're putting out into it. So you can measure how much you're able to exhale in one breath or something like that. Okay? So this is just showing you the typical output that a pulmonologist, somebody that works in the lungs, right, would get from one of the spirometers. So we're just seeing some of the example values of, let's say, for instance, tidal volume, like you see there. So tidal volume is a typical amount of air that you're going to be exchanging as you're sitting there doing resting breathing rate. And if you look at it, right, if we look at this graph, what we can see is on the y-axis, we see volume, lung volume. And notice this is in milliliters. So it says it goes up to about 6,000 milliliters. So how many liters is that? It's like, I don't know, metric system. What are you talking about? So milli means 1,000, okay? So if we have 6,000 of those, then how many liters is it? 6, right? So what that shows us is that on average, everybody's going to be a little bit different. The total lung capacity, you see way over on the right-hand side, can be almost 6 liters of air. Okay? Now again, if you're smaller, it's going to be less than that. Maybe it's 5 liters or something like that. And if you're bigger, it might be a little bit bigger. But on average, it's somewhere about like 5,800 milliliters, or almost 6 liters of air. Now that's the total lung capacity. And we're considering like the lower respiratory tract, the upper respiratory tract, and things like that. But realistically, even if you were to fully exhale, you wouldn't be able to get all the air out of your lungs. Okay? So let's look at this again. So we see the total lung capacity is almost 6,000, but if we refer back to that tidal volume we were talking about before, notice that there's 2 things about that that's interesting. Number one, it's much less than total lung capacity. It's about 500 milliliters of air, about a half liter of air that you're just going in and out and in and out breathing right now. Okay? So the tidal volume is a bit like the tide that goes in and out, etc. But it's only about a half liter of air. And also notice that it's kind of right, kind of in the middle of the full range of air that you could take in or put out. So you're not, like fully up here and just, right, breathing a little bit in, a little bit out, stuff like that. You're not doing anything like that. You're not way down at the bottom going, and then breathing little breath in and out there. It's right in the middle where you're kind of comfortable, right? So usually you're exchanging about a half liter of air when you're just resting. Now some of these other volumes are when you are trying to fully expel more air. So for instance, there's what's called an expiratory reserve volume. So if you were just breathing right now and you wanted to fully get the rest of your air out, you could recruit some of those abdominal muscles, etc., and try to push extra air out. And you would get more than that half liter, right? You would get almost another liter of air that could come out. And if you were, for instance, if you were going to blow out your birthday cake or something like that, right, you take your normal breath in and out like this, and then you go, and you take in as much as you can, and then you blow out that full amount. And if we look at that, again, it's not going to be as much as our total lung capacity. That's going to give you what's called vital capacity. That's the amount that you could, if you're trying hard enough, fully expel from your lungs. And that might be, say 4,500, something like that, milliliters of air. And there's always going to be this little amount at the bottom that's called the residual volume. And if you think about it, right, if the lungs are a bit like a sponge, right, and the sponge has all those little pockets in it, if you were just kind of giving it a little squeeze, you get a little volume out of it. And to a certain extent, we're not squeezing the lungs, per se, but, if we move them a little bit, then we get a little volume of air out. And in order to fully get water out of a sponge, you have to like flatten it, right? You squeeze it, and you wring it, and you flatten it as much as you can. You're not doing that with your lungs. You're kind of shrinking down this cavity, which increases the pressure, but you don't go flat, right? Unless you're getting like run over by like a cement truck, there's no way that your lungs are going to flatten and get all that air out. So that's that residual volume, that about a liter of air that gets stuck kind of in the lungs, in the trachea, and the bronchi, and all of that bronchial tree, okay? So even though you're breathing in, quote-unquote, fresh air and then exhaling this carbon dioxide enhanced air, you're not really getting like a fresh refill. Same thing as maybe your gas tank, right? So with your gas tank, when you go to fill your gas tank, you don't run it to total empty, at least hope not, right? Because then you're stuck on the freeway at 108 degrees outside, etc. So you go where you're getting close to empty or where you think you can't make it to your destination, and so you're putting in fresh gas. But there's always going to be some of that old gas that's left in there. So what you have in that tank is kind of a mix of fresh and a little bit of old gas. And what you're breathing in each time is mostly fresh air, but a little bit that's been kind of stuck in the respiratory tree. So it kind of mixes a bit. Okay? But it's still efficient enough for us to do our exchanges of oxygen and carbon dioxide, etc. Okay. So this ventilation that we're doing, where we're bringing air into and out of the lungs by contracting and relaxing these different muscles, is going to be under voluntary control. Now, the interesting thing about that is we're talking about muscle contraction. We're talking about a voluntary type of muscle. So these muscles we've been mentioning are what type of, we have 3 types of muscle. What type of muscle are they? What's our voluntary muscle type? Skeletal muscle, right? So you're thinking quadriceps and hamstrings and biceps brachii and stuff like that. Well, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles and stuff like that are also skeletal muscle. You know the intercostal muscles? Those are the muscles that you eat when you go to Tony Roma's and stuff, yeah? Right, right? It's between the ribs. And if you're looking at it, you can actually see the fibers. You can see the fibers for the external intercostals going this way and the internal intercostals going this way. You know, you got to lick off some of the barbecue sauce and stuff, but you'll see it next time. Okay. You can show all your friends. You're like, look, no, look. Okay. Anyway, so it's skeletal muscle. Now, it's under voluntary control, but there are lower areas of the brain, like the brainstem, that's going to be in control of it, okay? So what that means is you have voluntary control over it, but you can let the brainstem handle it on a minute-to-minute basis, right? So if you want to, anytime you want, you can hold your breath, right? Or you can take a big breath in, like we said, like blowing out a candle or something like that. So that reminds you that it's under voluntary control, but on a normal basis, your brainstem will actually handle the rhythm and how deep your breath is going to be and stuff like that. So those different, what's called respiratory centers, are really centered in 2 areas. 1, the medulla oblongata, and 2, the pons. Okay? Now, this slide talks a little bit about what's called rhythmicity, right? How many breaths you're going to take per minute and stuff like that. And it talks about a pneumotactic area and stuff like that. Don't worry about those specific terms, okay? In essence, you need to know that it's both the pons and the medulla oblongata of the brainstem that work to control respiratory rate. For the most part, it's the medulla, which is a little bit lower down, which has direct control, has nerves going down to the diaphragm, etc., to tell it how big of a breath to take and how fast to do so. But the pons, if you remember, the pons sits over the medulla, and its function in terms of respiratory system is also overseeing what the medulla is doing. So usually the medulla is handling the basic respiratory rate, and then if you have to do something weird, like if you really have to take a big breath in, we want to make sure we're not going to overinflate the alveoli and they pop or something like that. The pons is kind of overseeing those unusual breaths or something like that and coordinating with the medulla. So that's all you would really need to know in terms of our respiratory centers. Know that the pons and the medulla are the ones that are going to be involved, and the pons oversees what the medulla is doing. So when you see like, you know, all this respiratory center and stuff like that, don't worry about that for our exam, you know, for tomorrow. Yeah, don't worry about that. Okay? Okay. So, like usual, if we're talking about homeostasis, in the case of this system, we're trying to monitor things like oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, and even things like pH. So what's pH again? Do you remember?
Like basic or acidic.
Exactly. Yeah, basic or acidic, right? So, you know, you talk about pH in terms of your pool water and stuff like that. So the fluids of your body need to maintain certain pHs, right? So blood is of a certain pH. Blood exists between 7.35 and 7.45 on the pH scale. That's it. If it gets outside of 7.35 and 7.45, you actually go into what's called acidosis and alkalosis, and it can affect all kinds of body systems. So blood is certainly important, but there's other things. Urine has a different pH, and saliva has a different pH. Hydrochloric acid in the stomach has a different pH, right? That's pH 2. So pH is something also that we monitor to keep at homeostatic levels. So in terms of the respiratory system, there's a lot of monitoring that goes on in terms of some of these chemicals. So we're going to have chemoreceptors that are monitoring pH, monitoring carbon dioxide levels, oxygen levels, etc. And we're also going to have, in some cases, mechanoreceptors that are, again, telling us if our lungs are stretched or if there's some sort of, issue. If you have a cold or something like that, you might feel a tightness in your chest. Those are going to tell you about your respiratory function and how things are going. Now, when we keep talking about pH, pH really has to do with the concentration of free hydrogen ions, right? So a hydrogen ion would look like that. So it's lost an electron, and it's floating around by itself. And with free hydrogen ions and pH, if we have the more free hydrogen ions we have floating around by themselves, the more acidic something is. The more things we have floating around in a solution that can bind up and get rid of, if you will, hydrogen ions, the more basic it is. Okay? Now the reason that pH comes into play here is that, and we'll see this equation later on, when we have carbon dioxide in like a tissue or something like that, because it's being generated by the cells, what happens is, ultimately, we're going to want to get that into the plasma and transport it up to the lungs so we can get rid of it. And the way we do that is we take that carbon dioxide and we combine it with water, right? Water is found in plasma. It's like the main molecule of the plasma. And when we do that through a chemical reaction, what we get is H2CO3, okay? And H2CO3 is what's called carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid kind of falls apart, if you will, into a hydrogen ion, oops, a little plus up there, plus this ion, which is called bicarbonate. Okay? So what that means is, as our cells are generating carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide combines with water, it very temporarily forms carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid releases a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. So the more carbon dioxide we have going into our tissues, like when our muscles are working or something like that, the more acidic those tissues are becoming. Okay? And the more acidic the blood can become as well, because we're loading that carbon dioxide into the blood. We have to change it into bicarbonate. So you see that HCO3, that's bicarbonate ion. You can see how the carbon dioxide is within that, right? HCO3, if we look at that chemical makeup, it's got CO2 in it, right? So that's how carbon dioxide is commonly transported in the blood. But as we change carbon dioxide into bicarbonate, we give off these free hydrogen ions, which can make the blood more acidic. So we got to make sure that we're circulating that around well, getting it up to the lungs and getting rid of that bicarbonate and getting rid of that carbon dioxide. When we get up to the lungs, this is what's going on at the tissues, okay? When we get up to the lungs, bicarbonate ion is floating around in the plasma. Hydrogen ions are floating around in the plasma. You can't exhale ions, okay? You need to exhale a gas. And so when we get up to the lungs, and we have the pulmonary circulation going out to the lungs and pulmonary capillaries, what happens is this chemical equation reverses, okay? So what happens is the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion combine into carbonic acid again, and then that falls apart into water and carbon dioxide. And then the carbon dioxide we can actually exhale, okay? And water gets left behind. So the point is twofold for that equation. That's a pretty important equation because, number one, that's exactly how we transport carbon dioxide in the blood. And that's one of the topics that we had to talk about was how do we transport oxygen and how do we transport carbon dioxide in the blood? Because we can do all this exchange up to the lungs, but it's the muscle cells in my foot that need that oxygen and need to get rid of their carbon dioxide. So this is how we transport carbon dioxide into the blood, as bicarbonate ion, and that also, as a byproduct, gives us free hydrogen ions or makes things more acidic. And that's the second important point about this, is that this process of transporting carbon dioxide affects pH in the body. Okay? And that's one of the things that we have to control and monitor. Okay. So when the brainstem is getting information about carbon dioxide levels and hydrogen ion levels in the body, by taking a measure of pH, it gives us an idea about how much carbon dioxide is actually in the blood, because the more carbon dioxide we have, the more acidic things become. Okay, so we said we have these chemoreceptors, we've got stress receptors, which relay information to the brainstem, and then the medulla is going to tell the lungs, or at least the respiratory muscles, what we need to do. Are we accumulating too much carbon dioxide? If so, we better breathe deeper and breathe faster so that we can get rid of it. At the same time that we're accumulating carbon dioxide, those cells that are cranking out carbon dioxide like little factories are using up their oxygen. So we've got to also increase our respiratory rate in order to deliver more oxygen to them as well. Likely, right, the heart rate's going to have to go up, and the blood pressure is going to need to go up as well to increase the circulation. So we can ventilate the lungs faster if we want, but unless the carbon dioxide and oxygen are circulating faster, it's not going to do the rest of the body any good. So they're going to work together like we were talking about. So one of the things that the brainstem is going to want to know then is what are these levels, but where is it going to want to monitor these levels? Well, there's two major places that it's going to monitor it. Number one, it's going to monitor it within the central nervous system, because we want to make sure that those neurons are getting oxygen and carbon dioxide, or at least getting rid of their carbon dioxide as much as possible, so that they are able to function, right? So we have what are called central chemoreceptors, but then there are also peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid sinuses and in the aortic arch. So where's the aortic arch? What is that? Yeah, so it's that round, large artery that's superior to the heart. And that aortic arch is taking the oxygenated blood to the head and to the arms and to the lower limbs, stuff like that, right? So that's a good place to check to make sure that we've got a lot of oxygen and we've got low amounts of carbon dioxide, okay? The other place, carotid. So anybody know what carotid that sounds like or what it reminds them of? Yeah, so a lot of times you think about like jugular veins, right? You hear about like horror movies, oh, jugular vein got cut, etc., which is bad to be sure, okay? But worse is cutting the carotid arteries, right? So in essence, there's going to be jugular veins and carotid arteries on each side of the neck. And the vein is more superficial, as most of them are, compared to the arteries. But it's the arteries, as we reminded ourselves last time, that are getting those big tidal waves of blood, right? Veins are on the other side, and it's a bit slower there. So if you cut an artery, you really get a very quick loss of blood there. So anyway, the carotid arteries are going up here, and they are feeding oxygenated blood to the brain. So that's another good place to do a check and make sure that we have enough oxygen, etc., going up to the central nervous system. Okay, so that's why we have checkpoints in those particular areas. Okay, so reflexes and things like that, I think at this point, we won't worry about things like that, overinflation, etc. In essence, it just tells us that our monitoring system is going to keep our respiratory system doing what we need and protecting itself as well. Now, hyperventilation I'll mention just in terms of interest. Hyperventilation, you guys probably know what that is, right? So what does that mean? Just by looking at the word or what you know. Exactly, fast breathing, right? Ventilation is taking air in and out of the lungs. Hyper always means a lot, okay? So fast breathing, if you're hyperventilating, whether you're panicked or sometimes when people snorkel or free dive, they'll be at the surface and they'll take a few quick breaths, and then they'll go under, okay? So what that does is it very quickly reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood. It actually kind of gets rid of more carbon dioxide than your tissues are necessarily producing at the time. So what that does is it temporarily fools those receptors into saying, hey, you know what, carbon dioxide levels are pretty low. I don't have to breathe too much, right? Because it's monitoring carbon dioxide to say, okay, we need to increase or decrease breathing. And if the carbon dioxide levels are low, then when you go down underwater, you don't get as much of an urge that you need to breathe. So you can hold your breath longer. But the danger is, right, if your carbon dioxide levels are low, you've gotten rid of some excess, right? At the same time, your oxygen demand is probably still high. Those cells are still getting oxygen, your neurons, your brain, and the muscles, and things like that. And so even though your brain says, I probably don't need to breathe too much, your tissues are starting to get starved of oxygen. And if you're talking about your very active tissues, like your neurons, etc., then basically they can start malfunctioning while you're way down deep, right? So you're much deeper than you should be because you fooled your central nervous system into thinking you don't need to breathe. And by the time it kind of starts being aware that you do need to breathe, you're so far down, you can't get back up to the surface. And they can have people black out underwater because of doing stuff like that. So, I mean, if you're doing whatever, in an 8 or 9 foot pool, then probably not going to be an issue. But for the most part, hyperventilation is not going to be a good situation because you're just not listening to your body in terms of what its demands are currently. Okay. So, our first topic was ventilation then. Our second topic was exchange. Now, there's 2 places where we exchange. We exchange at the lungs with the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, and then we exchange down to the tissues between the systemic capillaries and the cells of the body. Okay? Now, the good thing about that is that the exchange that occurs at either of those sites is basically the same mechanism, and it's going to be diffusion. Okay? So we'll use the example of the exchange, what's called the external exchange, or the external respiration here. So, exchange between the atmosphere and the blood. And that's going to occur in these alveoli. Now, these alveoli are the little sacs that make up the lungs. And in this diagram right here, we can see an example of a large one, which you see here. Okay? So here's an alveolus. Remember that's singular. And you can see that its wall is made up of simple squamous epithelium. Right? So here's one cell. Goes right here. And it goes right there. Here's another cell, right? Goes along here like that, and then the nucleus of the cell. So it's only one cell layer thick. And as we saw in the pictures before, it's surrounded by these capillaries. Okay? Now remember that the capillaries are also a single cell layer thick, like we see right here. Okay? So when we look at this right here, this right here is called the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane is one of the thinnest membranes in the body because if we look at it, the respiratory membrane is going to be made up of this very thin wall of the alveolus, this very thin wall of the capillary, and then a fused basement membrane in between them. Okay? Remember that a capillary is so small, a single red blood cell has a hard time even going through it, right? A single red blood cell has to go through single file in these small capillaries. And it even has to bend partly with that concave surface in order to squeeze through it. So if this is about the size of a red blood cell, like 8 microns, you can imagine that that little respiratory membrane is thinner still. So it's nice and thin, which really makes it easy for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across it. Okay? The other thing you see in here is down in the lungs, we do have a few other cells too. These cells here are typically called, you'll see them listed as type 1 alveolar cells, the ones that make up the wall. You'll also see what are called type 2 alveolar cells as well. But you see there are other cell types here, right? Here's a cell that secretes surfactant. Here, this is a macrophage. Remember, a big eating cell, a phagocytic cell? And so they're kind of on patrol down there for things you may have inhaled as well. Okay, so like we said, our oxygen and our carbon dioxide are going to diffuse across that respiratory membrane. Now, diffusion, what causes diffusion? Why do things move? Why do they move from one area to another? Exactly, right? So we're talking about high concentration in one area, low concentration in another area. Like you talk about maybe like that party that you've attended where there's 2 rooms, and you're in the really crowded room, and you look in the other room, and there's lots of space in there. And so you decide to move that other area so you have more personal space in an elbow room. Okay? So that's also going to be the case for oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, the air that we breathe, a lot of people think that the air that we breathe is just oxygen, right? Because that's what we focus on in terms of what we need. But if you think about it, right? So we said that carbon dioxide is going to be out there because we're breathing out. Carbon monoxide is going to be put out by vehicles and factories and all these types of things, right? But there's also a major gas that's in the air that we don't have any use for. Did we talk about that? Exactly, nitrogen. So most of this mixed gas that we have up here is nitrogen. Almost 79% of it is nitrogen. So this is air that we have is actually a mixed gas. And so when we talk about concentrations, we have to figure out, okay, how much oxygen is in here, and how much carbon dioxide is in here in the atmosphere, and then how much is in the blood. Because that's where we're going to be comparing concentration. We need to know concentration in blood and concentration in the alveolus in order to get things to move across that respiratory membrane. So in a mixed gas, okay, each of those individual gases accounts for a portion of the total gas, of the total pressure of that gas. Okay? So before we were saying, atmospheric pressure is commonly 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay? 79% of that number, like I don't know what that's going to be, like 600 or something like that, millimeters of mercury, is going to be from nitrogen. And a smaller amount is going to be from oxygen, and a smaller amount still is going to be from carbon dioxide, etc. So each of those gases exerts its own what's called partial pressure. And really what that is that's concentration for that particular gas. Okay? So when you're reading about it in the book, you'll see partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, etc. But you can think of that as concentration. So you want to see where it's high, where it has high numbers, and where it has low numbers. And it's going to move from wherever it's high to wherever it's low. Okay? Okay. So we'll see that in the figure coming up. We'll see the numbers between, what it is in the blood, what it is in the tissues, etc. So, in essence, though, diffusion is going to cause these gases to move across that respiratory membrane. All right. So, gas transport is going to be where we're looking at how we move oxygen and how we move carbon dioxide. Now, luckily, since we'd already talked about the blood, we know that oxygen is going to be moved primarily attached to hemoglobin in the red blood cell. And over 98% of the oxygen that we have transported in the blood is bound to hemoglobin, which produces when we have that oxygen with the hemoglobin, we call it oxyhemoglobin. That's a pretty straightforward name. And so what happens is, remember, that's a temporary binding. So when we're up the lungs, we'll bind up oxygen, 4 oxygen per hemoglobin molecule, and then when we get down to the tissues, it will release it and give it to those areas that need it. Okay? Now, what happens is, there's a number of indicators that hemoglobin and the red blood cells use as to when would be a good time to deliver oxygen. And some of those indicators can be when the carbon dioxide in that local area increases, or it becomes more acidic, or when the temperature goes up, right? So if that red blood cell with hemoglobin and oxygen gets down to the tissues and it's really warm in that area, well, generally that means that there's a lot of activity there. A lot of chemical reactions when they occur, they release heat as well. Muscles generate heat. So if it's coming into an area that's warm, it makes sense that those cells are probably active. That means they're using oxygen and they're generating carbon dioxide, so it's a good place to offload some of that oxygen. Of course, carbon dioxide levels, if there's more carbon dioxide, at the same time they're putting out carbon dioxide, they're using oxygen. So we're going to need to deliver oxygen to them. And then we said that pH is directly related to carbon dioxide levels. And so if it's acidic in the area, that's a good place to drop off as well. Now, if that's not working, sometimes you hear about this term, which is called hypoxia. So it's kind of like hypoxia, okay? So hypo means low, and oxia, of course, refers to oxygen. So if you have a tissue that is not getting the oxygen that it needs, it's called hypoxia, or the tissue becomes hypoxic. And there are various ways that can happen. If you cut off blood flow to a particular area, right? Tourniquet, or your legs just bent for a long period of time, something like that, then those tissues become hypoxic. If you're anemic, like we talked about before, and your red blood cells don't have enough hemoglobin, there's not enough iron in your diet or something like that, then again, your tissues can become hypoxic because the blood is not delivering the oxygen well enough. Okay. So this figure right here brings two of our last topics together. One topic was we were talking about actual gas exchange. Okay. The other topic was transport within the blood. So if we look at this figure, we see an example on the left of the alveolus with a pulmonary capillary next to it. And what we find is that oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood, right? Because the blood that's arriving here in these pulmonary capillaries is deoxygenated blood. It's the whole reason that it's gone to the lungs is because we need to get rid of that load of carbon dioxide and we need to pick up a new load of oxygen. Okay? So, when we get down, then we're going to transport it, right? We said that oxygen is going to be bound to hemoglobin. Now, take into account, right? We're trying to show you the hemoglobin molecule. Hemoglobin molecules aren't just floating around by themselves, right? They're in the cell membrane of the red blood cells. Okay, so take that into account in this figure. But once we have them bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells, we're going to transport them down to the tissues. Now, the tissues, okay, oftentimes what happens is when we started out in the alveolus, maybe we had a concentration of oxygen of like 100 millimeters of mercury, okay, like this. And in the tissues, or in the pulmonary capillaries, it was like maybe 40 or so. So you can see that there's a high concentration in the alveolus compared to in the blood, so oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood. So now once it gets down to the tissues, it's still pretty high, right? It's about 95 millimeters of mercury. Okay? Now when we get down to the tissues, these cells have been working hard, and they've been using up their oxygen, so now we see that their concentration, right? The P there means partial pressure, so that just means concentration. So in the tissues, the concentration or partial pressure is very low, like 40 again. So this time, we're going to see diffusion going this way, out of the blood and into the tissues. So we can deliver that oxygen to the tissues to make sure they're getting what they need. Okay? Now, by the time we get all the way through the capillary bed, we've delivered enough oxygen. Our oxygen partial pressure concentration is dropping, and now, by the end of it, our blood partial pressure concentration is down at 40 again. So now we're low. We got to take this blue blood and deliver it back up to the lungs so we can get refreshed. Okay? Okay, so that's for oxygen. In terms of gas exchange, it's just diffusion. Where it's high, where it's low. Okay? In terms of transport, most of it, like 98%, is bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. There's a very small percent, 1 to 2%, that actually just diffuses or basically dissolves in plasma. Okay? But most of it is bound to hemoglobin. Okay. So flip side of the coin, carbon dioxide. Now, for carbon dioxide, we talked about that equation already. And that equation told us that carbon dioxide is mainly transported as bicarbonate ion, right? Carbon dioxide plus water gives us carbonic acid, which dissociates into a free hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion, like you see there. So probably about 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate ion, like we see in that chemical equation. Okay? The rest of it, about 30%-ish, is transported attached to hemoglobin. And to a certain extent that makes sense, because as the hemoglobin in the red blood cells gets down to the tissues, it's got these 4 binding pockets and it drops off like 1 oxygen or 2 oxygen or something like that at the tissues. Well, now it's got a free little pocket there that's not holding on to anything. Carbon dioxide is coming in, so it makes sense that the hemoglobin could actually pick up a carbon dioxide and transport that along as well. Okay? So about 30% of the carbon dioxide actually is bound to hemoglobin as well. But most of it is in the plasma as bicarbonate. Okay, so this figure that we see here shows the same thing, but we're looking at carbon dioxide. So we said that we've got the bicarbonate, right, HCO3, that's going to be in here. And when we get to the tissue is going to have a relatively high concentration of carbon dioxide. Now I say relatively because with oxygen you're like talking about 140, which is a pretty steep gradient, right? Now we're looking at 45 as our high in the tissues, and when we look in the blood, we see 40. Okay? So it's not as much of a gradient, but it's still a gradient, which means that carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissues into the blood. Now we said that most of it is going to be changed into bicarbonate. You know, the crazy thing is that chemical equation that we talked about actually occurs inside the red blood cell. So there's an enzyme that's involved that will facilitate that chemical reaction that we see right there, the CO2 plus H2O, etc. And that enzyme is in the red blood cell. So even though most of the carbon dioxide is not transported in the red blood cell, that chemical conversion occurs in there, and then the bicarbonate diffuses out of the red blood cell and is transported in plasma. Okay? So you see that by the end of that capillary, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the plasma is about the same as what we saw in the tissues. Because that diffusion is going to continue until equilibrium is reached. Like if you're at that party and you're feeling crowded in your room and you look over the other room, it's about the same concentration, you're not going to waste your time walking all the way over there because it's not going to make it any better. So diffusion is going to continue until there's no more gradient, until it's the same concentration. That's why we see the blood leaving is now the same concentration as the tissues themselves. Okay? So we'll take that load of carbon dioxide back up to the lungs, and then in the lungs, when we inhale air, the air that we inhale has a very low concentration of carbon dioxide in it. So that 45 that we have in the pulmonary capillaries is much higher than what we have in the lungs, and it will diffuse into the alveoli, and we can then exhale it and get rid of it. Okay? Okay. So those are our processes, right? So ventilation of the lungs, getting the air to go in and out of the lungs, exchange, both of the lungs, and then down the tissue. So we can package those together because it's all based on diffusion according to concentration, or what we call partial pressure. Okay? Then, so that was two topics right there. Then, we also had gas transport, right? And so we need to know how both carbon dioxide and oxygen are transported in the blood, which is something we mentioned in the cardiovascular system, or we're highlighting again here. Okay? So that, in essence, is respiratory system.